Come on, Bob, help me out.
For the next hour, we'd like to invite you to take a look at what a dozen people, all of them seasoned professional community builders, have to say about the conditions helpful for good community development. They are all members of the Center for Studies of the Person, a professional community which has been together for over 25 years. The center was founded by Carl Rogers and a few others to do research and training on what people need to achieve their fullest potential. That same year, Dr. Rogers, founder of client-centered therapy and the person-centered approach, and fellow psychologist Richard Farson, appeared in an Oscar-winning documentary, Journey into Self. In this film, 8 strangers met for 2 straight days, and with a skillful facilitation of Rogers and Farson, people gradually became more honest with themselves and with each other. By now, this film has been seen by millions who are moved by this intimate and real look at the struggles of the participants to become themselves. But the focus on self-development presented in that film had its share of critics. Some psychologists were seen as misusing their knowledge of people and their personal charisma to encourage a glorification of the individual. Other critics concluded if the individual were encouraged to look too much at himself, he would end up being negligent of society's best interest. But Rogers trusted the individual. He felt that self-development leads to a more just society, not to its ruin. That the person who understood himself, using the means at hand, was less likely to be destructive, more likely to be constructive. From the beginning, Rogers and his colleagues recognized that an important part of their work was not communicated by the film Journey into Self. That was the very special way members of person-centered communities endeavor to treat one another, what Rogers called the core conditions of client-centered therapy. What was not emphasized in the earlier film was that people do not make their deeper journey into self without the influences of others and under any old conditions, but rather they are able to make a deeper journey when others communicate to them a sincere commitment to empathetic understanding, authenticity, and an unconditional acceptance of them as human beings. These conditions, the basic values of person-centered relating, are the conditions that allow people to be who they are in their hearts, and they are the conditions that encourage groups, families, and communities, including this one, to remain together over the long haul. Attending to a person, as well as to her ideas, is an art and a challenge. Members of this community have practiced this kind of attending for a long time and are living it now in front of you. For you to understand their journey into community and how it applies to you, it helps if you can allow yourself to be touched by their actions, feelings, and thoughts and not judge them. So try to pay attention as much to how people are as to what they say. Members are talking about community, they are also living it. For the next 35 minutes, you will see members of the Center for Studies of the Person in one uncut segment of the 16-hour weekend they spent together in the studio. Afterwards, some of them will reflect on these core conditions of the person-centered approach and how these conditions are represented here in this community. We enter the group the morning of its second day. So far, the discussion has been focused on the center's community history. As we join them, Will asks how the way of being together which has kept the center intact all these years could be applied to the larger world, say, like Bosnia or South Africa.
One of the things I think about in regard to dealing with the suffering is acknowledging it. And when I'm home eating and seeing it on TV, for example, I may acknowledge it, but that isn't the same as, that's a private act almost. And that's what I'm thinking about the community is that, what if the community acknowledged that suffering, including the people who are killing each other, if that's what's going on. That's the hard part, really. I'm thinking of international, I'm thinking of Bosnia right now and what's going on there. And all of them say, yes, we're suffering. But there's something about a community to nourish them. I mean, the UN and various people are trying something to incorporate the conflicting parties in a crucible, trying to form a crucible that they can both say, yes, I'll be in this with you. And the only one they seem to be continuing to accept is the one where I'm going to be in this crucible to eliminate the other party. And that's the hard part. How do you get that community to whatever it is to form? On what basis?
Yeah, I think about the very hard work, and yet it's challenging and it's possible. I mean, I continue to believe it's possible to do that, to move and be different. My brother-in-law, last weekend we were in New Orleans, and he was asked to go to South Africa and be one of the persons observing the election. And for whatever reason, there was some, I can't remember what he said, he couldn't go. And I thought about that history is yet to be made, to use a term from a friend of mine, that it's fantastic about the possibility for us as human beings. If we think about at this moment what's going on in South Africa, at this moment,
never thought,
not in my lifetime.
Never thought it.
Yeah. I mean, so it's there's tremendous possibilities.
Yeah. When I was listening to the news about South Africa this week, I was remembering that the Anti-Apartheid march in London, that's 35 years ago, was the first political demonstration I ever went to. I was 15. And we stood for 72 hours in Trafalgar Square. And I was listening on the radio to what was going on in South Africa. I couldn't deal with it. I didn't believe it would happen in my lifetime. But I remembered the 15-year-old I was, and I was so it was like I moved out of childhood into adulthood in that weekend, having to confront what was really going on. And one of the people in the audience, who was interviewed on the tape, said the British people were an important part of this process. And I'm used to hearing how the British have been such villains in colonialism and all the rest of it, and I'm used to that. What I wasn't expecting was to see this black South African pay tribute to that demonstration 35 years ago. And it felt like that was somehow that was all the thanks I needed. Was that, that was enough. I mean, what was happening was obviously enough, but personally, that recognition by somebody that it does take a world community to make some things happen, it was really powerful for me. And that was driving down the freeway with tears streaming down my face, thinking, oh, okay, things do happen. And then
you
thinking,
were a part of it. I mean, you stood up
well, with 250,000 other people, and every one of them counted, in my opinion. But then I thought, so Bosnia, I don't have to be in despair about Bosnia. I don't have to be in despair about the Middle East. It's like it gave me a boost for feeling that it's worth continuing, even though there's times when it feels like it's utterly hopeless. And was very important recycling of the whole idealism. And I think that's what I was meaning at the beginning of this, is that my idealism needs to be reaffirmed, and this comes in peculiar ways, but it so frequently comes by being in community, whether it's a 72-hour workshop or whether it's this long-term community. That was very important.
I was thinking how that was your innocence and your lack of guile. And while it was carried in an ideal, it was more that you said, I left my childhood or my... It was like you brought that into that, and you weren't jaded or you said sometimes I get into hopelessness or despair, but in that state you're definitely not there, and it's like it's possible.
Right. Yeah, I was 15. So what can we take on now? We got the voting in South Africa. What next? That's really good. Yeah, that's exactly right. It was exactly right. I was 15.
So isn't it? How do we get to that state? And because it's in that state, isn't it, that this action and this passion that is represented in an action, maybe locally rather than globally, but is. And yet I'm going to have my adult experiences. You know, I'm going to give an education, and I'm going to learn how difficult it is, but how do I not get enmeshed in that? And I see you like that then, Marina. The last thing I want to say is I see you're still there. I see you still are able to get back to that innocence or that guileless, but you're wise, you're smart, you're able to articulate probably better than the 15-year-old. But I still see that basic part of you. That's the part I resonate with in you more than anything.
That's very sweet.
And yet it has ideas, you know, so I value the ideas, but it has that life, that innocent, guileless spirit. Fight. There's a fight in that spirit, too.
Yeah, that's true.
What's the belief that your voice counts, too, which you still express.
I think that's what drew me to Carl's work, in some way. That sort of, that what his work was really, what it said to me was that your voice counts, that your experience counts, that your subjective experience counts, and it seemed to me to be kind of essentially about that, essentially about the significance of individuals, not individualism, but individuals.
And it includes your heart and soul counts, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a voice of hope in a time, in a world in which there was a lot of despair back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think.
Did you see the pictures from the voting?
Yeah.
I mean, it was
And
just unbelievable.
Lines
and people
and conversing
and young white kids and young black kids and old black people and old white people all just dancing around like 15-year-olds. It was absolutely scrumptious. It was terrific. But it was, I mean, that's hard sometimes to keep a sense of hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's hard not to get cynical. It's hard not to get jaded, and it really is.
Absolutely.
I guess I'm feeling the joy of being a human being and how we, the incredible tenderness in each one of us how frightened we might be of, how frightened I sometimes am of losing myself, or frightened of disapproval or rejection, or and so that feels very little me, but also that I'm big me in some ways too, and I was in touch with that when you were talking about how joyful you are about what's going on there, and that you've been part of it, and then there's the part of you that also, it made a real big difference that someone said thank you, that you made a difference. And so like we can be gigantic, and we can also be our tender self that needs a thank you, or that needs to say, yeah, I'm not disapproving, or it's okay, you're not going to lose yourself, or and I just feel this olive I feel all of me right now for just being here, sharing what you had to say and what you two were doing together, and it's part of being alive, you know, being here, being alive here in a community that's different than being alive all by myself. Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking now, I guess that's why I've never grown up. That to grow up to me meant to lose that innocence and with it that passion and that spirit that I felt you were expressing. And I don't know, that came to my mind, like that this seemed foolish to lose that, but I never realized that's what I was not going to lose.
That's a
really?
gift you have. It really is.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Right. But boy, has it been a battle. Because sometimes, I mean, lots of people would like me to lose it.
The one who say, grow up, Bob.
Or at least tame it or do something with it, you know, like put a leash on it. I love it. Oh well. I'm all shy now. Talk about shy. Where could I go hide?
There's Robert.
There's Robert. There's Robert. Oh, brother.
See, if we keep looking at you, get redder and redder.
Like Bob says, go on.
Change the subject, for God's sake.
Come on, Bob, help me out.
We don't. And if we don't.
No, you're an imp. Impish Norman. He's hanging in there.
He's your friend, remember? I saw a journalist talking on television about what's going to happen in South Africa next. And as he said it, I said, he's right. He said there's going to be a lot of killing. This is the kind of, everybody's happy, but they're all promised that the world is going to be wonderful within 2 months or 5 years, and that ain't going to happen, and people are going to start building these things, sort of like we saw in Europe, it was Eastern Europe, when the promise of democracy was, you know, I mean, we were happy when the wall came down, it wasn't all going to be great, and it turns out not to be so easily changed in the way that people were hoping. So there's some sort of a real roller coaster of hope and feeling like I'm all here, and then this wash of good God, it's all back into horrendous conflict again that I hate. And I guess it's riding through that with the ability to stay with myself during those times when it goes up and down like that.
I was thinking about, before you started talking, I was thinking about the people we work with in the Soviet Union. And, you know, we were there at this moment of the peak moment of great hope and possibility right after the coup had failed. And it was so exciting to share in their hope and their sense of the human potential and what they wanted to do with that. And I've been feeling so much despair about what's happened to them since. And yet when I get letters they have, you know, the people I'm hearing from, which isn't everybody, of the hundreds of people we work with, there's still something, there's been a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And there's still a hope and a belief, despite the way the difficulty in realizing the dream.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to hear, because, you know, I lose it. I just feel the despair.
What is it that they say that conveys their hope and enthusiasm?
Well, it's there's a sense of life going on, and you know, I think of one person who just got a new job where he has more power to carry forward his dream, which he got clear about in working with us, of wanting to really do person-centered training of psychologists and of teachers, etc. And so he's that, you know, deputy director of an institute now, where he has some power to really do that, and they're doing it on a commercial basis instead of, you know, the old state-supported way. They're now planning workshops and having to enroll people who pay for them, but they're doing it, and it's not easy, but they're doing it, and they want to be connected with us, and they hope we'll come again, and so that it's happening. And then there, you know, there were letters about a woman I interviewed who was, I think, 59 years old, who was retired, who was active in the Young Grandmothers Club, because she was very involved in taking care of her grandchildren in their retirement. And I got a letter from her daughter telling me that this feisty little lady had gone back to school and taken bookkeeping and had just started her own business as, you know, doing accounting and bookkeeping for all these new businesses. So it's like, you know, it really helped me, and to get over the despair, to say people are, without the rigid structure, people are finding a way to be more fully themselves. Some people, you know, and then you think of the pensioners who just don't have the resources to.
I think that what you're bringing up is something that I struggle with a lot philosophically, of the seeing what happened in Europe, and certainly looking at Bosnia and Sarajevo and that whole scene, the question of, are people better off in peace under oppression or in turmoil trying to find their own way? And I, as a therapist, I deal with that with clients too. Are people better off adapting to the status quo where their life goes on fairly okay, or is it, do they need to break out and deconstruct the whole thing to reconstruct? And I don't have any final answers on this at all, but I think first of all, I think we underestimate the violence of a system like apartheid, that it, just because it's not necessarily throwing bodies in the street, although it did plenty of that, that the daily dehumanization of a whole life from cradle to grave seems to me to be as hideous a violence as anything else I could imagine. So I think some of this issue for me is a question of how do you frame it? What are you comparing? And what often happens is people are comparing the stability with the chaos and equating stability with comfort and chaos with discomfort. And I don't think that's true. I think stability in certain kinds of oppression is daily torture. I think women have talked about that. I think minorities in this country have talked about that, and certainly elsewhere. But by the same token, without some kind of help in the period of turmoil and chaos, the chances of it being restored to a new kind of oppression, that's what scares me the most, is that the way it gets solved is not to move to a higher level of harmony with freedom, but that we can't sustain the chaos long enough, we can't tolerate it. So what we do is we replace the system of tyranny. And I see that in individuals, I see that in organizations, and I see that on a cultural level. And I don't know how to avoid that. I see people avoid it, but I'm not sure I know how they do it. I'm not sure I know what needs to be there for that turbulence to result in a higher level of integration and harmony, more democratic and yet more harmonious, as opposed to a new tyranny. And that's intellectually one of the most pressing questions for me.
I think we've been addressing that. That for me, I did that. A lot of work on myself was opening up, and then I could have gone into tyranny, but I was in a community that wasn't about that. And I could see how my fear, when I was so vulnerable and so exposed, how if I didn't have a place that allowed me to just be in that and come back, to myself, integrate, reconstitute. I could see how I would, because of that fear, I could accept somebody who was willing to say, well, I'll take care of you, I'll look at you, and I'll, like the devil and Daniel Webster, for your soul, I'll make you come to it. Because it's very vulnerable. Just like an infant. I was thinking of your innocence as a child and mine, but really even more helpless than that, more powerless than that. So people didn't, in this community, I'm talking of CSP and WBSI first, and didn't do that. They just, but what they did was important. They held my hand, they supported me, they listened, they let me be in their community, because sometimes it was very hard. I'm looking at David and Bruce, some of the people who were there. Very hard. I'm sure you guys, I remember some episodes now. For them to let me be in their community. It was hard. Because I must have been scary to them too, in a way. And not to assert a kind of power or a kind of authority or something to correct it. And some people did that. Now that I think about it, some people in those places did that. Because they were scared. And the intention was good. The interesting thing that authority and that it can be a benevolent dictatorship. It can be, the person
the intention can be benevolent. I don't know whether it is benevolent.
I know, but what's that? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like that kind of, But it really was the trust. I guess we were saying yesterday, trust the process. Trust, but I like just trust. Just trust. I think that's really vital, not to go into that other place.
It certainly makes a case for communities, doesn't it? It makes a case for communities.
Yes.
It is certainly for the whole notion of community. It makes a real case, and I really like what you're saying, because I had the privilege of being with you at that time too, and I thought for me, I don't know the months necessarily, for 26 years paying monthly dues to an organization. How come? And I think you just did it. You just said it. Is that no matter what, I know we could do it here. I could do it here, no matter what. I don't know what I did, but whatever it was, I could do it.
Right.
Yeah, no matter what. There was, you know, it was broad enough and deep enough that I could do it here.
Yeah.
Because needless to say, I'm sure everybody here has asked that same question, and yet here I am.
Yeah.
And it, I think that's it. That's enough right there. Just
when you say do it here,
do
what is
whatever.
the it?
Stretch
Be
and
yourself?
grow and come apart to come together.
Yeah.
And the coming apart may not have occurred here, but the knowledge knowing that this was here, so I could do it any place I wanted to in the world. You know, and
to give you an example with your question, to concretize it some more, I remember now one thing I did with Norman, and one of these places when I was just all apart, and medical models and that would call this psychotic or psychotic break or whatever, and rightfully so by their definition. I went to Norman and told him the place I was in, and because my tears of joy. I mean, he was there. And Norman went to the center. Because I know it was... I'm short of breath now. I know it was hard for you. I felt that way when I made that choice to go to you, but I was lost. And so Norman called on people in the center and had a meeting. I don't know if I ever thank you, but thank you. But it was really, I don't want in this moment to get lost. It's very important to come apart. It was really, it was the right thing to do, but boy, was it important to have that support. And people who would listen in spite of their fear. I was in such a place, I just know this is going to be scary. And I didn't want to scare anybody like I'm hearing us say that to each other. You know, I don't want to scare anybody. I didn't want to be the cause of it, but I had to do that. And I really trusted you, and you let me trust you.
thank you.
That's a long time ago.
Oh, long time ago.
I'm aware when Zan was talking a while ago how community serves me for holding hope when I don't have it, and I'll hold it for you when you don't have it. And community is also a place where I can swim around lost, and there will be a safe place to swim, you know. And so even though individually sometimes the relationships within the community are, some of those other things are true also. You know?
How do you spell that? Yeah, that's good.
I really like that phrase, holding hope when I don't have it. Just. And I think that CSP symbolizes that in the world. You know, when we get out of the United States and we go to other countries, it's been my experience, or the way people write to us from far-flung places, that we symbolize this crucible of hope for the human spirit or these values. In a way that's remarkable. I mean, when Carl died, you know, all the letters we got from around the world of people who'd read his book, or been in some little way exposed, felt in community with us. I mean, this is they needed to deal with their grief by connecting with people with shared values, and so they wrote to us. It's really holding the hope.
I'm working inside to integrate this personal experience as well with the political issue that Maureen brought up about, and that Bill did too, that in a transition period, the risk of going into chaos and then into authoritarianism, and that you just kind of expect it to happen in South Africa, that there will be all this killing and chaos and or moving into authoritarianism as is happening in Europe with the neo-Nazism, and how to bring that, and we keep using that word crucible, into the process of change, so that in the chaotic time, for you personally, there's a crucible, and a particular one who holds hope about you. How do we translate that into creating a crucible so that in a transition times in cultures, like in South Africa, that the risk of going into psychosis or oppression isn't as high? And for me, I believe that holding the hope without being a having it be a religiosity, holding the hope in these principles that we work together, is for me where I allow myself to empower myself to voice that in the world. And so when I am working in Europe recently and I hear myself being idealistic or talking about something like that, that I know that I'm going to get a response of, oh, you're all too idealistic, and you think that this will cure everything, and others who feel, oh, it's so good to hear a voice of hope that encourages me to be in a state of hope as well. And sometimes that's in the same person. The person resisting my hopefulness and idealism is the same person who's yearning desperately to want to hear that, so that gives them their own strength in their own culture, in their own school, in their own family, in their own community, to do what you did at 15, or to do what they're going to do at 55 or something. So I think there is a gift that our work can offer outside of us, from the very living of it so viscerally among us, and being able to try to translate it without being naive and things like that. But I mean, it gave me hope to see young people marching all over Europe against neo-Nazism last week. Or to speak with a German in a workshop who spoke about his fatherless generation, a man of 55, that he was the fatherless generation in Germany because all the German soldiers, so many of them died. And for me to be able to empathize with that man at that moment was as important for me and for us and our relationship and our sense of hope that we would be there today and that day sharing that together, and that he would then go out, which he did, and has raised lots of funds to rebuild synagogues in Germany. I mean, it's all, so every little bit of hope that's, I don't know. Anyway, that struck me that there is something in a chaotic transition period that we need a crucible of support, and these principles, I think, really take us often through that, without denying what's out there.
I think I'm conceptualizing it as that in some ways what we're calling these principles are equivalent to a constitution. It's like constitutions are crucibles, and traditions, cultural traditions are a crucible. And the person-centered approach has cultural traditions, which is part of how we build the crucible. And I think that it's precisely because at times of these massive changes that all those crucibles that people have used up until that moment to hold their community sort of disintegrate and have to be rebuilt, that there is this real terrific, awesome potential to either create a better crucible or to disintegrate into utter anarchy and violence. And I think it would be really interesting for us to try to articulate what are our traditions, what are our principles, what are we using to create what we know of as a crucible. And I'm thinking that maybe that would be a good thing for us to talk about together on before we finish today. Because I think they're there, and I'm not sure we've talked about them specifically so far on the tape.
I'd like to do that.
Yeah, that'd be good for the next session, I think.
I like that.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of stopped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They haven't stopped. They're still filming.
It's still going well. This might be the best one.
Uh-oh.
I've had the privilege of meeting with people from all over the world who come to learn more about Carl Rogers and the person-centered approach. Over the years, Rogers' theory evolved from non-directive counseling to client-centered therapy, and then to what we now call the person-centered approach. Whether in a one-to-one therapy relationship or in a group or institution, Rogers found that when growth and healing occur, an atmosphere is present that is characterized by three conditions: empathy, or understanding; congruence, or genuineness; and unconditional positive regard, or acceptance. If these characteristics are present in the manner and being of the therapist or the teacher or a consultant or whomever, they facilitate growth.
These characteristics have really moved into the mainstream of our culture. Empathy, authenticity, and acceptance are valued by psychologists, spiritual leaders, organizational leaders. You hear it in everything they're saying and writing, but they are not acknowledging Rogers' theory as the source of that. On the other hand, as we move into managed care, short-term therapy, etc., humanistic psychology is really being totally devalued with no regard for the human being. So there's a paradox in that.
While people from other countries, particularly those emerging from oppression, are drawn to humanism, the opportunities are shrinking in the United States for people to heal themselves and each other by this way of caring and understanding, this way of listening and being heard, this way of expressing and receiving genuine honesty and compassion. These are the qualities that people may seek in community, along with the possibility of acting together to implement shared goals. When people are not heard and valued in their work, or in their family, or in their church, or in their school, they may seek other communities to which they can belong and feel validated. Sometimes these communities are positive, even on occasion crucibles of hope, as CSP was called here. And sometimes they're negative, like some gangs which offer belonging but have destructive activities.
I was attracted by the silences in that segment that we saw of our community life. The silences of individuals, and some of whom didn't have anything to say while we were there, and the silences of everybody, some moments when nobody had anything to say. And in some strange way, those silences are an enactment of that constitution that Maureen spoke of near the end. What is that constitution? Well, it's listening. It's listening to the stories that each person has to tell, and listening to one's own story as that story is being told and relating to it. In some sense, these silences are our free space for non-judgmental understanding of what's going on for someone else and for ourselves. As we listen to stories, we ask, is it my story? Is it her story? How do they connect? And we gain our values and our meaning from these stories. In some sense, we get to reaffirm or find new stories for ourselves, and we're able to remember and able to move on. I spent most of my working career with business and other work organizations, and in all of those organizations, we're very concerned about increasing our output. We get great value and meaning from the productive sense of productive kind of our work. This attention to the productivity sometimes leads us to neglect the needs of other experiences which give meaning and purpose to our lives in the workplace. We lose touch with these other essential values other than production. So the pauses, the silences as it were, are important in work organizations as well.
I could really relate to Will's comments about corporation being production-driven. I worked for a company like that for a number of years, and we functioned in a climate where brilliant analysis was the order of the day, and we bought into that and neglected the human side of that equation. So at some point, it became clear to me that I had a lot of intellectual stimulation, but a pretty hollow feeling about my role in that company, and that my values were not part of the company's values. And I thought about what were the things that were missing, and I think it all starts with the leadership of that company taking a view of their people that with the right incentives they'll get good work, and then helping those of us in the company who come to the company with limited relational skills to help us with those Carl's core conditions of listening and positive regard and congruence, staying in touch with our own feelings, and then producing the environment where communities can flourish, work teams and quality teams and all of that that's developing these days. So I think there's some really good movement in that direction. But as I think back on my life, there's a sadness that that opportunity was missed.
I think it's important to mention here that a group doesn't have to be together for 25 years to be considered a community. In my work as a university teacher, a course is maybe 40 to 50 hours long, but during that time, we are a temporary community where those core conditions are modeled, they're discussed, they're applied. We sit in a circle, including myself, so that we can see each other, know each other better, literally show our caring, our support, even our disagreements. Sometimes when an exceptionally successful community has been built, the last day of class is extremely difficult, and often the group, or at least part of it, will plan to meet from time to time in an effort to sustain the positive feelings that the class/community has provided.
At the Center for Studies of the Person, I'm involved with the La Jolla program. The La Jolla program is an opportunity for people to come together for a few days to build community. And people literally come from all over the world. Apparently, it's one of the few places where you can come and spend a few days simply paying attention to yourself and to one another without the distractions of our everyday life. People go very deep. They get to know themselves in a way that they might not have ever before, or at least not for a while. And they're able to sort of check in and see if the life they're living is the life that they really want for themselves. People become very closely bonded in this community, and people report that it's a very special experience, one that they treasure.
When I first came to La Jolla to study with Carl Rogers, he and his associates had just finished the documentary film Journey into Self. The focus of that group was, which soon became Center for Studies of the Person, was on what we can do as professionals to facilitate another person's journey into self. One way we facilitated this journey into self was to organize 1, 2, 3-week workshops, often residential, in which we spent a lot of time talking in small groups of 12 or so, and also singing and playing and talking in the entire group of, say, 24 or 124 or more. We started using the word community to describe what we saw us as in the workshop. Since then, the word bonding and community building are frequently used to describe what happens in these workshops, whether or not the workshop is homogeneous or heterogeneous, for men or for women, whatever. Apparently, people in our society, at least for a few weeks, are very often open to finding a gentle, loving closeness with one another. Apparently, we have a capacity for this way of being together that is difficult to fill in the fragmented, soundbite, time-driven world most of us live in. Of course, you can have communities organized around economic and political goals, but when I use the phrase journey into community, I'm thinking of communities organized around our spiritual and social needs for one another. That is, this is where I have my professional interest and personal experience, along with my first love, journey into self. Sometimes it seems like they are the same journey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. First order of business.
What's going to come of it, but it was...
It's hanging out.